To the CNBC TV 18 special. I'm here at the NITI headquarters in New Delhi in conversation with the Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog, Arvind Panagariya. Mr. Panagariya has completed 2 years and 8 months in office and has now decided to head back to the United States. Joining us for his first interview after that decision is Mr. Panagariya himself. Thanks very much for joining us here on the show, sir. Let me start by asking you about when you took this decision to head back to the US. Our last conversation was just before Prime Minister Modi visited Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump. It's been a little over a month since that happened, which happened towards the end of June. There was absolutely no inkling of you wanting to leave or considering even the possibility of heading back. When was this decision taken?
No, the decision was very recently, but the process was already in the works at the time, because I met the Prime Minister in mid-May and mentioned to him that my leave was ending at the end of August, and therefore I may have to depart, and he was keener. Actually, the PMO subsequently also communicated with me that the Prime Minister was keen that I stay for the full term, meaning it's the co-terminus with his term. So I discussed the matter with the Dean of the school at Columbia, but the leave in the end could not be extended, and so therefore at that point, once it became clear that leave will not be extended, I had to then discuss the possibility of leave.
But, were you not aware of this possibility that your leave perhaps would not be extended beyond a 3-year period? Because you just signed up, sir, for instance, among the many things that you've been tasked with is for the new jobs data committee that's been set up with you as the head of that. And in our last conversation, you said that it will take at least 12 months for you to be able to put that together. So, you were aware of the fact that 3 years your term would end, then why would you take on new responsibilities?
No. Look, the institution's work cannot be stopped just on the possibility that you may not be here after a certain date. My institution's work has not stopped even today. I think, just because the Vice Chairman of the institution is slated to leave on a certain date, the institution's work cannot be allowed to be stopped. Now, any major decisions which will have long-term implications, those clearly, the successor ought to have the room to make decisions, but otherwise, certainly I don't think that this is a good policy that you stop the institution.
No, I'm not suggesting that you stop the institution. I'm saying that you took on charge of an additional responsibility.
No, this was a committee. I will actually, the report of the committee will be completed before I leave. Before I leave. Yes.
Okay. I want you to comment on an article, on a column that's been written by your successor, Rajiv Kumar. And for the purpose of complete accuracy, I will quote him in exactly what he says in Hindi, because the column is in Hindi. And he suggests that Raghuram Rajan पहले ही विदा ले चुके हैं, अब अरविंद पानगरिया भी समय से पहले अपना पद छोड़ने का ऐलान कर चुके हैं. वहीं लतियन दिल्ली की अफवाहों को माना है तो आगे ऐसा और भी इस्तीफे हो सकते हैं. ऐसे में हमें शायद उनकी जगह पर ऐसे विशेषज्ञों की तैनाती देखने को मिल सकती है जो भारत की जमीनी हकीकत को कहीं बेहतर तरीके से समझते हैं और जिनकी प्रतिबद्धता कार्यकाल पूरे होने तक टिककर काम करने की है और जो बीच राह में जिम्मेदारियों को अधर से छोड़कर ना चले जाएं. Implicit in that, actually explicit in that comment there is the fact that he believes that there's been a parachuting of foreign experts into India's policy-making arena. There's a lack of commitment even, and leaving midway is the charge that he's making. How do you respond to that?
So, Shereen, on this, I follow the advice and rule of a good friend of mine, whom you know, Dr. Vijay Kelka. The Vijay Kelka rule is that you should not comment on either your predecessor or on your successor. So I think I would refrain from commenting.
Okay, don't comment on the specific points that he's made with respect to either Raghuram Rajan or even to you. But on the larger issue that he makes in this column of his, where he talks about imported experts having formulated policy which is not really necessary for India or relevant for the India of today, where he talks about the IMF and the World Bank influenced experts trying to dovetail policy making to the Western narrative as opposed to Indian realities. How would you respond to that?
Unfortunately, the context still remains the specific article that has been written, or specific sets of articles that may have been written by my announced successor, and so therefore, if no matter how, whatever I comment is taken in that context. So this is not the time for me to make that commentary. If in different contexts, if the context is different, the similar question is asked, I will certainly be at some point happy to give you my take. But the current context is unfortunately very intimately connected to what my successor has written.
Let me ask you, sir, finally on this issue, because I don't want to push you into a corner on a matter which you don't wish to comment on. But given what you've heard or you've seen today in the form of this article and this column, do you feel disappointed? Do you feel hurt? Are you pained by what you've seen being written?
Well, I'm sorry, but my response is the same, that I would refrain from commenting because it does relate directly to what my successor has actually written. So I'll follow the Vijay Kelkar rule with strictness, and sorry, I'm not really going to comment on it.
Fair enough. I won't get you to comment further on what Rajiv Kumar has said, but let me get you to comment on the charge that's been leveled against the Niti Aayog by the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, for instance. And this is public information. They've gone public with it, saying that the Niti Aayog has been following the Western narrative. The Niti Aayog has been working for foreign companies and foreign corporations and so on and so forth, and they're disconnected with India's realities. How would you respond then to the charges that have been leveled by organizations like the Swadeshi Jagran Manch?
No, I mean, this is something I have said before, that look, there is nothing I have done in my 2 years and 8 months that I did not see in the national interest. Everything I have done, I've kept the national interest in mind foremost in front of me. Now perceptions of what we think, what I think is in national interest and what the Swadeshi Jagran Manch might think is in national interest might differ, but I stand by the fact that nothing other than the national interest determines what I do. And I will continue to do that, actually, even after. I mean, this is something I have done for almost 2 decades of my life while writing on India in the media or in my interviews to the media, plus my scholarly writings actually in the media. I mean, scholarly writings otherwise. And likewise, as I would continue to do after I return to Columbia, I think the guiding principle is going to remain the same.
Do you believe that there is already a shift in the economic narrative of the government, or that there is likely to be a departure from the government's stated policies of maximum governance, minimum government, and perhaps, as Rajiv Kumar points out, our understanding of what that means is different from what the government believes it ought to be. Our understanding of it seems to suggest that the government will get out of being in businesses where it has no business being. It means strategic disinvestment, it means privatization, but perhaps that may not necessarily be the course to take. Do you believe that there is a shift in the economic thinking, in the economic narrative?
I'm not quite sure here how you are putting the question. I mean, there was a shift when this government came in office.
Yeah.
From the narrative that existed when the UPA was ruling the country. There had been that shift.
No, I'm talking about talking about the economic narrative of NDA 2, which came with the promise of ease of doing business, minimum government, maximum governance. and again, I go back only...
So let me understand. Yeah. So you're saying because either because I am leaving or because a new successor is coming in, could that lead to the change in the narrative? Is that the question?
That's a separate question. The question that I'm trying to say is that have we perhaps, as Rajiv Kumar seems to suggest, that we've misinterpreted the government's thinking when it comes to things like maximum governance and minimum government. He says the Reagan-Thatcher model of economic development is not going to work in India. It's failed globally. There is no relevance for that in India today. Are you seeing...
So you're bringing me back to commenting.
I'm asking whether you believe that there is a change in the economic narrative.
No, look, economic narrative is determined by the leadership of the country. That is first and foremost the Prime Minister and then his ministerial colleagues. And I don't see that they have changed, or nor do I know of any change of mind on their part. So I personally think that, you know, as long as the country's leadership remains the same and has not changed its mind, I don't see why the narrative would change. So that's my reading of the situation currently.
You know, several recommendations have been made by you at the Niti Aayog. As you look at everything that you've done over the past 2 years and 8 months, if I could ask you to assess, what would you highlight as being the biggest achievement, the most significant milestone, the most significant recommendation that has actually been acted upon by the government?
Oh, a number of these things we have done, you know, they are all related, and some have been acted upon, some will be acted upon, meaning they're in the process and so forth. But clearly the closure of 6 units that we started, that is a reality today. About 18 to 20 units are in very advanced stages of closure. Privatization, we have talked about it, and we have said, you know, that the expectations I had have not been met, which is correct. I certainly would agree with that. But the process is underway. You would have liked the government
to have been much more aggressive on strategic disinvestment.
On that one, it would have been. I think that would have been my understanding of Prime Minister's view also. So somehow the system has not been able to respond.
Has the system not been able to respond, or perhaps there has been a change in thinking even at the end of the top leadership when it comes to how aggressively ought to be with strategic divestment?
No, I don't think any reversal in thinking has happened, not to my knowledge. I mean, you know, maybe you speak to a wider set of people than I do, so you may have more information, but to me, I have no such information that there has been any change of thinking. The process is moving forward. It has not receded in any way. Lots of transactions advisors have been appointed who would be carrying out the privatization of several of these 6 units, several of these units that we had identified, and the cabinet had approved for strategic sales. So that's on medical education reform that we, in all 3 areas, the allopathic, the homeopathic and the Indian systems, all 3 areas that we had pioneered, is progressing. So it'll, you know, down the road be done, is my expectation. So number of these things, you know, education reform, which we are still in the process of, which will go on. And from our point of view, of course, we laid down also the roadmap of reforms in the form of our 3-year action agenda.
You know, speaking of the reform action agenda, and this is linked to the broader vision that you have as far as healthcare reforms are concerned, education reforms are concerned, I know that the feeling within Niti Aayog has been to not just enhance efficiency, but also look at ways to enhance efficiency across these sectors. And one of the ways has been to look for possible ways of encouraging private sector participation in these sectors by way of collaborations with the state. Has there been enough of a buy-in at a larger top leadership level of those ideas?
Well, if there is no buy-in at the top leadership level, then we would not do it. Naturally, we have to operate within the political system within which we work. Yes.
Okay, so and do you believe that there continues to be the appetite of more private sector collaboration in some of these sectors as well?
Well, look, you know, both in education and health, we can't pretend that private sector is not there. When your, you know, when our own children go to private schools, when we get sick, I mean, I work for the government, so it's a little different, but you know, my own family members, if they get sick, they go to the private hospitals. They all exist. There has to be a collaboration, and why should we not mobilize the energy of the 125 crore Indians? I mean, in the end, if we are really going to progress together, it's not just the government sector which has to progress, but also the private sector that has to progress. I mean, the energy of India is not the energy only of the government.
Yeah. You know, speaking of some of the unfinished items on the agenda, sir, let me pick up on a few of them. I know your big dream was the special coastal zones, the special employment zones. I know that is another area where I would imagine that there is some degree of disappointment at your end, because this has been something that you've been pushing forward with for about 2 years now. Do you believe that is going to be something that we will see go through?
Well, first of all, I'm disappointed, Shereen. You know, a person like me is in it for a very long haul.
Yeah.
I mean, if something has to, if the condition that it's something that should fructify within a year or within 2 years was the case, then of course I would have folded my bags long back. I mean, you know, as an academic, I persevered in this profession for 20 years, writing about changing the minds of the people on economic policies, economic reforms. So, you know, we take a very long view of these things, and, you know, the policies that we initiate, I mean, even within the government, you know, the GST initiative was started more than 10 years ago, and it is finally fructified. So I absolutely have no pessimism regarding the coastal employment zones also. I think there is something that the country is going to need, and this will happen. It's a matter of time. Yes, you know, it took long, it may have taken longer than I would have liked it, but I have no pessimism in this respect. I think this is a good idea which is gaining by the day greater and greater traction, and we'll see this happen.
One of the other responsibilities that you were tasked with is also the high-speed rail network, and I know that you've been visiting Japan several times during the course of the year to ensure that we meet that 2018 timeline that was broadly being worked on. You know, how confident do you feel about the high-speed rail network project being on track?
Yeah, well, so far everything has been on track. We have had very explicit deadlines on different milestones, and all milestones so far have been met, and so I'm personally quite delighted that exactly as the roadmap had been chartered is being followed.
And on the jobs front, sir, because that's been your latest responsibility, has been to set up a new way of measuring jobs in this country, and you said that you will be able to deliver that before you leave the Niti Aayog on the 31st of August. So have you been able to put everything together in terms of what this new measurement tool will be?
So as you know, we have put out actually a draft report of the task force, which is available for public commenting. In fact, we have also received the public comments. Sometime during this week, the task force will meet again to discuss each of the useful comments that have been made and what modifications we should do to the report, and subsequently we'll then finalize the report and submit it. So before I demit the office, this report will be done.
Let me ask you, sir, how has this stint in government changed your view of economic reforms, how economic reforms work? Do you now perhaps have greater degree of sympathy for those in office when we talk about, you know, big bang reforms and rolling out big bang reforms faster and so on and so forth? What do you take back from this experience specifically?
I've not changed my mind fundamentally. Fundamentally, I had always argued that the top leadership has to be committed to reforms for reforms to actually happen, and I think that view actually has been reinforced, that that is indeed the case. the only the new thing that I learned is that sometimes even with the top leadership actually wishing for certain things to move may actually stall because certain offices may not move fast enough.
The bureaucracy?
May not move. Offices are basically bureaucracy. But so the bureaucracy can sometimes delay, although it cannot stop. If the top leadership wants something to happen, then action does eventually happen.
So do you believe that the bureaucracy has delayed the pace of reforms that the top leadership would have liked, you know, over the last 3 years?
In some areas, yes.
What areas specifically?
Well, I think it is not appropriate for me to give any details, but broad answer I have given you.
What would you say are the big challenges as you leave the Niti Aayog, sir, and you've put together a 3-year blueprint, and there is going to be a 15-year roadmap as well? What do you believe are the key challenges that India faces today, the Indian economy faces today as you leave the Niti?
Well, the big challenge you have already sort of alluded to it is the job creation, and here what I mean is not just any jobs, but jobs that would employ people at the relatively low skill level at a reasonable level of productivity and therefore reasonable level of wages. By all accounts, based on the surveys that we have been doing for several decades now, the unemployment rates in India are not particularly high, so people are employed, but the issue really is that they are employed in jobs that are not subject, that don't have a very high productivity, and therefore they don't pay the kinds of wages that are required today to have a comfortable existence. So I think that is where, and the solutions to that ultimately will have to come from the expansion of the labor intensive industries, a greater share in these industries such as clothing, the footwear, all sorts of light manufacturers, including perhaps even electronics, etc., in the world markets. I think these are the products in which we need to conquer the world markets, because that is where the large markets are. Like electronics alone is a $2 trillion market. Our share in it is very, very small, and likewise clothing market about very large again. China alone exports $175 billion. We are exporting less than $17–18 billion.
So India needs to capture more of global trade.
Absolutely, because that is how we'll create jobs which reflect high productivity and which then also pay higher wages.
So let me then end by asking you, sir, how has your stint here at the Niti Aayog changed Arvind Panagariya, the academic?
Well, I think the impact of that we'll still see in the years to come. I mean, what I'm reminded of is when I left the World Bank, first time when I went there, 1989 to 93, I had spent about 4 years at the World Bank, and in the end I came out of the bank a different economist. I had been a theorist prior to that, and I did turn into much more of a policy economist. And I suspect some change along similar lines would probably happen as a result of what I have done in the last 2.5 years. Probably it's also going to impact the way I teach some of my courses. I'll probably have a better understanding, at least within the context of India, of the political economy, of implementation of policies. So I think we continuously change, and I think the same process will unfold itself.
So if I could ask you for a wish list, sir, as you leave office, on the top unfinished reforms that you hope and believe that the government will take forward. Let's say you hope that the government will take forward. What would the wish list be?
Okay, so you're allowing me a list. That is good actually, because I don't like to give 1 or 2 or something, So the wish list has to ultimately be around what needs to be done for job creation of the kind that I have just described. And that would mean, of course, just because we need the world market to be captured by by the firms that are operating in our country, I think we need to do things that will bring some of the global firms in these sectors, these labor-intensive sectors, on the Indian soil. And in my thinking, a part of that effort has to be in the form of the coastal employment zones. But that's not all. I think we need a broader based strategy, and that would involve also further trade liberalization, trade facilitation, extremely important.
Yeah.
I mean, very recently some of the captains of the textiles industry, to my horror, told me that, look, JNPT,
yeah.
our prime kind of port, stays open only for 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
Now, even airports stay open for 24 hours a day. We have to have the ports, in 8 hours. If you look at Singapore, Hong Kong, the ships turn around. They come in, unload their cargo,
yeah.
and turn back to and reload basically also,
yeah.
and
yeah.
then they go back. So we need a whole lot of trade facilitation issues sorted out. A lot of the clearances that are required for exporting products and all have to be speeded up, or those that are unnecessary should be eliminated. Infrastructure has to continue to develop, and roads built faster, railways built faster, transportation to the ports and from the ports has to be much faster. So a whole lot of these in trade reform I've mentioned, that we I've argued that we should perhaps consider unifying all our tariff rates around 7% or so. That will also take away all the inversion of tariff structure. I think going forward we'll also need to unify the GST in such a way that at least for the exporters we got zero rating of products. When you're exporting, no domestic taxes, domestic indirect taxes ought to be exported. I think that's WTO consistent, WTO rule, and that's a good efficiency rule in economics. So a whole lot of these things we need to do. If we can really capture the global markets in these labor-intensive products in the way China did in the late 80s and onwards, and continuing actually till today, I think we would have actually laid down solid foundation for not only good jobs being created, but also steady, sustained growth at 8% or even higher for the next 2 decades.
Well, Mr. Panagariya, always a pleasure speaking with you, sir. We wish you the very best of luck as you head back to the US. It's always been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much once again for your time.
Thank you, Shereen. My pleasure.
With that, it is time for us to wrap up this CNBC TV 18 special.